Welcome to That's What I Call Marketing, the podcast where you will hear from the leading lights in the marketing world and listen to their unique insights. Well, it is end of year time. Of course, every great podcast does a predictions episode, looking forward to what is coming ahead next year. But no, not what That's What I Call Marketing. We are looking back. We see this year, our singles episodes have been powered by Tracksuit, the always-on, affordable brand tracking dashboard that's now available in 25 markets. And so what we wanted to do was look at some of the biggest stories that we hit on this year and see where things had landed for those brands. We were able to look at the brand health metrics of those brands at the time of the stories hitting. And we have now taken a look back 6 months later, 9 months later, and seen how things have gone for the brands in terms of their brand health metrics. So this takes you away from the stories and the spin, and it will give you the real insights and the real data on some of the biggest stories this year. Before we get into today's episodes, if you are enjoying That's What I Call Marketing and can give us a Christmas gift and rate or review the show, it would be much appreciated. It is a great way for new people to discover That's What I Call Marketing. And it is the Christmas gift that would keep on giving because more and more people would discover That's What I Call Marketing. Today's episode is, of course, brought to you by Tracksuit, the always-on, affordable brand tracking dashboard that, as I said, is available in 25 markets now. And if you'd like to find out more about Tracksuit, go to gotracksuit.com and you can find out all about their dashboard. But look, chat to the team, put in a request, speak to them, spend 20 minutes with them. It's a no commitment thing just to discover what the platform can do for you. It is transformative for your brand, take my word for it. So go chat to the guys. As I say, it's a non-commitment thing. Sometimes people feel nervous about it, but go and chat to them. Last thing before we get into today's episode, I have to call out a wonderful person who has helped with every single episode of the singles, but hasn't been on the singles yet. Maybe next year. It's Grace from the Tracksuit team, and she has just been wonderful. She's brand partnership manager. She has been so amazing in helping us pull together all the data that we talk about in these episodes. So Grace, thank you so much for everything. Right, let's get into our look back 2025. Dan and Jasper, great to see you. And this is an episode we talked about a couple of times, actually. We're kind of going to do a bit of a look back. Everyone this time of year looks ahead to next year and predicts, but no, we're going to look back. We've got data and we're going to look back. It's some of the biggest stories we've talked about at the singles this year, and some of the most listened to, some of the clips that got the most views. So we're going to talk about Tesla and the year that they've had. We're going to chat about American Eagle, how can we not? And then there's been a lot of acquisitions this year. So we're going to touch on two of them, Rhode and Deliveroo, and see how things are going for them post-acquisition. So let's hit straight into it. So Tesla, God, Tesla's had a year, hasn't it? Elon's kind of stepped back a bit out of the limelight. You don't hear about him as much, but also just a category where we've seen, you know, EV demand changing. The home market for Tesla is getting really tough in the US. Big kind of that competitive set is thriving now. You've got, like, you know, the Chinese brands really starting to make their mark in Europe and the UK. So lots has happened for Tesla. But let's look at what the brand health is telling us, the US, and we have US versus UK data as well to see how things are different for the brand in both those territories. So how's it going for Tesla?
Yeah, it's interesting when you do these look backs. You typically want to look forward so that you can ignore if any of your predictions were completely wrong. So here's the moment of truth with Tesla. I mean, Tesla's such a fascinating one to look back on this year because you can, I mean, from a brand health perspective, which we'll dive into, is still leading the innovation race and how they're perceived to be so innovative. But as I think you'd expect over the course of the year, and this big question of how do you divorce founder brand impact versus company brand? How does that drive brand fundamentals? I've seen a lot of movement there in, you know, a negative light. But then when you look at the market itself, absolutely soared from a stock price perspective, has grown 44% in the second half of this year. And so it's trying to marry this story of like tech narrative not lining up with impact on brand and like fundamentals of the company from an analyst perspective of looking at, exactly to your call, Conor, competition, thinking about just rising costs, and then also the brand impact. So, I mean, as you called out from a category perspective, V demand has been relatively inconsistent over the course of the year. Global sales are down. Tesla's facing competition across the board in both UK and the US, especially in the UK, from BYD coming in across Europe with a cheaper, more affordable, competitive offering. And then equally, Tesla's sales globally have dropped across the year. Looking at brand health, what we've seen is just a solid like erosion from preference within the US. And so awareness was never the game that they needed to work on. He has the, the famous halo effect. Their awareness sits at, roughly 79%. Consideration is modest, as you'd expect, as quite a famous brand, but where they're really starting to see erosion is, a 3% drop to 6% in the US, which is a pretty remarkable decline. And what's most troubling about that from their perspective is it is in the demographics that they would really want to win. So that's high household income earners. That preference measure has dropped 8%. And then when we look at 25 to 34-year-olds, that's decreased 6% over the second half of this year. And so it's really hard to start telling these stories of, from an investor lens, hey, you're probably pretty happy with the future outlook your Tesla is sitting, but then from a brand fundamentals and commercial fundamentals, it hasn't been the year I'm sure they would have hoped.
Yeah, and like things like trust, for people like me, for someone like me, like these are things as well that they're losing ground there as well. But like if these metrics like trust, or for someone like me, if they can't start moving those and moving people as well, it's not going to convert for them next year. And that's where probably some of the real problems lies, and where they're probably most at risk.
Yeah, completely. They're seeing more impact from not only trust, but also relatability. So when we think about the perception is for people like me and how does that drive funnel conversion, not only has Tesla underperformed from a trust perspective, but that is the key category driver here, at least in the UK EMEA. So it's one of those things where, they still lead and tell this phenomenal story around innovation, but now they're really coming up against competitors that are differentiating themselves outside of just being the most innovative brand. And we're now starting to see, how does Tesla combat that? Just trying to tackle this from a product standpoint. And when you've got BYD coming in with a competitive car that is, a third of the cost, now Tesla's really trying to push back, and they've just released the Standard. Now they're trying to punch against these lower cost competitors because the brand really isn't standing up to be premium. And they really do have this brand headwind of, they might be innovative, they might be premiumly priced, but are they really drawing that relatability back to consumers to justify that premium price against what is now an exceptionally crowded market and a brand that's really not resonating with consumers? So really starting to see trust erosion and preference erosion in both markets, but then has the further impact of just not having a whole lot of relatability with consumers and a lot more options for EV brands.
Yeah, and I think as well, like when you look at something like Tesla and where brand tracking comes in and can be helpful. I mean, they're in so many markets, they're available in so many markets. And I guess always on brand tracking would help them see these trends and where the problems are starting to show up for them. And then they can address that and see the issues for your competitors as well.
Yeah, completely. Like identifying that trust is a brand perception that you need to start to drive is just like one step of the phase, but then it's breaking it down by the different segments and demographics across what is a global brand, to understand what is really the job to be done for certain demographics in each market, and where do you want to play and where do you want to win. They might be completely accepting that certain age demographic isn't where they necessarily want to be winning right now. But for a brand like Tesla that is premium and priced accordingly, to see an erosion in preference from a household income demographic layer is absolutely something you'd want to lean into and identify. And so it is all starting to see how does the brand impact of this year start to flow into the commercial impact next year.
Yeah, I think just to very quickly build on that as well, and Conor, I know you mentioned it about from the brand tracking perspective, and I think that is what does become quite critical. I think particularly in categories such as EVs, or where Tesla would sit or operate, which is within a much more considered purchasing cycle of a category, where understanding not just the performance of their brand, but also that of competitors, and then understanding what that looks like when you apply it from a category view as to which of these statements or which of these attributes are the biggest drivers in moving consumers through the funnel, and then correlating that with that brand health performance to understand if we can see, to Dan's point, there's erosion beyond awareness, but not necessarily understanding where or how to attribute that erosion. And if we can obviously understand through our data that we can see trust is a key driver, and that is where they are not performing, certainly relative to competitors, then that's where the data can start to become really strategically applied, certainly within, well, from a marketing perspective.
Yeah. And it is interesting, at the time when we talked with Tesla, did say, you're not saying we're right, but we did say we thought this might be an impact of some of the things that were happening at the time. So, gold star for us. And you're right.
And then gold star for, any brand that can sit within a category where you can lean into this like future earnings expectation of like this phenomenal like robo-taxi growth story, as opposed to what has necessarily happened in the last 12 months. So I guess the takeaway is listen to the signals or lean into a category that...
Yeah, definitely. Listen to the signals. It's much easier. It's free. So moving on to, as we said, like that's a high consideration, like, big purchase category, and to move into something that is kind of low loyalty, high substitution, fast moving. And we're going to talk about American Eagle. Now, we talked about in the episode, they were in the toilet. They had a real problem. People weren't even thinking about them. But from kind of the brand health point of view, how have we seen the impact of the Sydney Sweeney campaign? Because they really haven't done anything else since. So what's nice about this is we can say, you did Sydney Sweeney campaign. What has that done to brand health?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, so back in August, episode 9, I believe it was, when we first covered the American Eagle and Sydney Sweeney campaign, we've been keeping a close eye on their brand health data in the US just to track how it's moved over the past few months. Now, interestingly, American Eagle have recently reported a surprise 10% EPS gain, with revenue up 6% to 1.36 billion, and comparable sales growth accelerated to 4%, which was beating expectations by all account. And their CEO, I think, commented that American Eagle's strong momentum, which was fueled in part by a Sydney Sweeney ad campaign, continued into the holiday quarter. And of course, the campaign being referred to here is the Sydney Sweeney Has Great Genes, which was a campaign that drew widespread criticism, controversy, but just there was a lot of attention around it. And I think if we zoom out to the category context for a moment, and as you've mentioned, Conor, clothing is a low loyalty, highly interchangeable category, which sits at 93% penetration. And that's important because I think controversies in fashion rarely cause immediate sales crashes. And instead, they tend to chip away at relevance, emotional connection, and preference. And that damage usually only shows up months down the track. And this is exactly why earnings calls aren't always the best lens for judging brand damage. So earnings are more backward looking, while brand health is a leading indicator of future performance. And when we look at American Eagle's brand health performance, awareness is still strong. So they're sitting at 74% awareness, which puts them broadly on par with other well-known household brands such as Old Navy and Target. But this is where it gets particularly interesting, is it's the funnel beneath awareness where we start to see that erosion. So over the past 12 months, for context, consideration is down 6 percentage points from 42 to 36%. Investigation is down 3 percentage points. Usage is down 1 percentage point. And preference is down 3 percentage points from 13 to 10%. And that decline in preference is critical because when we're looking at the competitors and at a category level, Old Navy sitting at 18% preference, Target's at 15%, and American Eagle is, of course, now, as we just mentioned, at 10%. So in the context of the category, American Eagle is falling behind a number of the other key brands. And this is exactly where brand tracking matters during periods of public reaction, because I think whilst sales have clearly held up in the short term, brand health reveals that damage that earnings can't always see, and declines in consideration and preference put that long-term growth and performance at risk.
I think you said it there brilliant. Like, it's the short-term trap that they've kind of fallen into. They've seen a bounce in the site sales spike, but we're seeing kind of those metrics that are going to matter going forward as decline. And so I think we did say at the time, like, the challenge with it is the brand didn't really stand for anything. It
Yeah.
was trying to have a bit of a joke, but it didn't have anything to go on. Like, this wasn't a creative platform.
Yeah.
It's a thing that they did. And so that was our biggest problem with it at the time. You know, they can't do a Christmas campaign with this. They can't do a, you know, Q1 campaign.
Yeah.
So they definitely have fallen into that kind of short-term addiction, which would be interesting then to see next year. Do they do another one that gives them a short-term boost? But is the decay then in those metrics like preference going to be too damaging and they won't see that lift? I don't know.
Yeah, 100. I mean, and this is the thing. I mean, this is the data and insight that really arms marketers with quantifiable evidence of how provocative campaigns or moment in time campaigns can change how people think and feel about a brand. And to your point there, Conor, I mean, this is really also where it does become critical for business to invest in long-term brand building and more consistent storytelling for their core audiences rather than prioritizing attention over sustainable brand growth. And Les Binet and Peter Field are clear on this point that brands that rebalance towards long-term investment recover faster and more sustainably. And then there becomes less dependence on promotional activity. So promotions really should be there to harvest that existing demand from people who are already in market. And that's having obviously already been brought in earlier on the brand journey. And I think when brands and businesses do invest in longevity, do invest in that brand platform, of which obviously campaigns can go on to be built upon, execute, almost just create the business foundations, that's just where we start to see that real sustainable growth. Because obviously, as we know, and as we've seen in a lot of the reports that we've run, and has been widely covered by the likes of Mark Ritson and what have you, is that consistency is key to a lot of this.
There's brilliant. We have it here. And actually need to mention Grace, who is on the Tracksuit team, who helps us with all the data that we pull together every time we do a singles episode. And it's just wonderful. But just kind of a brilliant line. And you can almost see it on the slide, right? Would you put this in front of your CEO? The campaign didn't hurt sales, but the brand is weaker than it was.
Yeah.
Like that almost feels like the headline to this, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
What are we going to do about it? Like that's a killer realization that you're only getting if you're tracking frequently.
And then even next year, like resurfacing that slide once we see that decrease in sales over what has been the brand impact of the last 12 months.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, another one that we were right about.
Just
saying. Yeah. If you want to find out more about Tracksuit, go to gotracksuit.com and find out how they can be your affordable, always on brand tracking dashboard. The next one, again, we talked like there was a lot of kind of acquisitions through the year that we discussed, but we picked two out that we wanted to have a look at. And the first was Rhode, acquired by Elf Cosmetics. And I've mentioned so many times Elf, I think, is a wonderful brand, wonderful company. They had a bit of a glitch this year, didn't they? It was the Matt Rife thing that went awry for them. Anyway, they did one thing that didn't work with Matt Rife, but I think they got away with it. But they acquired Rhode, a $1 billion deal. And again, with these acquisitions, it was really interesting. So we'll talk about Rhode first, then Deliveroo. But what's interesting is Rhode's probably a great example. They have a very specific audience, right? And they're being bought by a bigger company that has kind of maybe a broader audience, and Elf wants to scale Rhode, right? Like they're not buying it just to keep what it's doing. They want to scale it. And then maybe the risk is through that acquisition, you lose your way a bit with your core audience. So how have things gone for Rhode?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so I'm sure as many of us will know, acquisitions absolutely have the ability to strengthen brands. I think particularly in terms of output, so they can bring more resources, broader distribution, bigger budgets, new capabilities, but they do also carry risks for brand health. And I think that could be from diluting brand identity, confusing consumers, to cultural clashes and inconsistent customer experiences. So I think the key for any post-acquisition growth is ensuring that it doesn't come at the expense of the brand's core equity and long-term relevance. And I think if we look at Rhode post-acquisition by Beauty, as you mentioned, Conor, back in May, and as we discussed in episode 7, I believe it was, back in June, we've been monitoring how their brand health is performing in the US among their target audience. So from June to November, within the 18 to 34 demographic and within the makeup and cosmetics category, Rhode's funnel is rising, and that's across the board. So awareness is up 6 percentage points from 26 to 32%. Consideration is up 7 percentage points from 9 to 16%. Usage is up 3 percentage points from 3 to 6%, and preference has doubled from 1 to 2%. So the top of funnel metrics are moving in the right direction. But I think particularly, or where it becomes particularly interesting, is insights that come from the brand meaning signals. And this is really where that integration risk can show up. So Rhode is strong on trendy at 58%, which is equal with Fenty and well above the competitor average of 38%. But Rhode is weaker on premium at 26% versus a competitor average of 34%. And just for context, Fenty sits at 45%. And this is where brand health measurement does become a critical tool for any marketer, as it essentially allows the businesses to see whether that brand is actually growing demand across awareness and consideration and strengthening preference and pricing power rather than just riding a short-term moment.
Yeah, it's really, and it's such a competitive space as well. This whole, the makeup, cosmetics, I have a 15-year-old daughter, I have an 18-year-old niece, and, this time of year, the requests for different types of makeup, and there seems to be new ones. Well, to me, new ones popping up all the time. So it's very, it's highly competitive amongst that crowd. Strong brand is going to be definitely one of those things.
Yeah.
Completely. And to Jasper's point earlier, the advantage there being in a category that is so competitive and product differentiation can be relatively limited, understanding where your competitor set is winning within a category and where there's opportunity to identify what whether it's brand perception or brand positioning matters to your target demographic amongst that competition is incredibly valuable. And for something like a Rhode fitting into the e.l.f. portfolio, seeing an acquisition work in the level of how their brand health has improved, but it's not hasn't just been about, our awareness has skyrocketed, but it's actually seeing strength throughout the whole funnel. And to see that conversion improve throughout the funnel is really positive to show that there was real utility in acquiring this brand.
And they didn't try just throw the e.l.f. marketing playbook on top of Rhode either. That wouldn't have worked, because it's to me, that's a very specific thing for e.l.f. that works really well, and they do it brilliantly. But they didn't say, we're requiring you now do all the things we do because that got us to here and we want you to get there. They seem to have taken the time to understand, again, the audience, the culture, how they fit, and allow Rhode grow in a Rhode way with maybe the support of the e.l.f. machine, which is, again, very smart, but maybe unsurprising because they seem like really smart people at e.l.f.
Yeah, completely. And I think just to touch on that point about the scalability, I think it's really about operationalizing the brand promise at retail. So for a brand like Rhode, moving from D2C to major retail is where the customer experience can get stress tested. So things like availability, staff advocacy, sampling, returns, Rhode's Sephora expansions, I think a major growth opportunity there. But I think it's also a test of that brand consistency and almost ensuring now that consumer journey is going to be mapped slightly different to what it looked like pre-acquisition. So ensuring that obviously they evolve from a marketing perspective as where the brand is showing up, just to ensure that there's that continuity and consistency, and they're not presenting consumers, either those in markets, the existing demand versus future demand, with those potential clashes in what the customer experience looks like.
Yeah. Brilliant. Great story there. And the other acquisition we were going to touch on was the DoorDash acquisition of Deliveroo. Again, kind of really competitive space in the UK. You've got Just Eats, Uber Eats, Deliveroo. And I think we said at the time, awareness, not the issue for many of these brands. It's more kind of lower down the funnel that the fight was happening. So, how have things gone for Deliveroo since DoorDash acquired them?
Yeah, it's interesting. Not dissimilar to the results of what we've seen in terms of Tesla's challenges, in terms of conversion efficiency and preference. To your point, Connor, the acquisition here was within a hyper-competitive space where we see consumers holding multiple apps, whether that is Just Eat, Uber Eats, and Deliveroo, switching up maybe between meals. Maybe it's Just Eat for breakfast, Deliveroo for lunch, and someone else owning dinner. But it's one of those things where there's very limited brand loyalty. And so what are consumers actually anchoring to, and how do you, whether you're acquiring new consumers or in the instance of the rationale we saw with DoorDash is, how do you acquire local commerce, that global distribution that Deliveroo had within the UK and Europe? And so we haven't seen a lot of movement in terms of awareness or consideration at the top of funnel. There is a strong hold of Just Eat sitting at 89% awareness, and Deliveroo is sitting in the low 80s. Interesting, what we have seen is that that conversion efficiency through the funnel has dropped off. And most notably, we've seen preference at the bottom of the funnel drop from 23% to 21% in the second half of the year. So the big question, I think something like this is, how do you ensure you're not competing amongst two brands, and how do you kind of see that product integration between them? So would expect that there would be a bit more time to see how the DoorDash and Deliveroo acquisition takes shape, but have started to identify some of those brand perceptions that aren't resonating within the UK for Deliveroo. And that sits around, cheap fees and being weak on value. And that the others is like helpful customer support. So it's all the areas that you can differentiate with consumers from a brand perspective. That's not just, hey, how do we turn this into a race to the bottom, but change the conversation to be, hey, we deliver on value, we deliver on time, and we deliver on customer support, and haven't necessarily seen those key attributes outside of price really move the needle for consumers for Deliveroo off the back of the acquisition. So something that hasn't been as a successful story as the Rhode acquisition of Elf, where that's, we've seen that convert really nicely into brand health, whereas this is still, strong performance, but actually there's work to be done for Deliveroo as a core brand.
I was going to ask you about the knowledge score, because that's been a brilliant addition to the Tracksuit dashboard this year, being able to look at that, like, what level of knowledge people have of the brand. As a marketer, it allows you to start thinking about what are the problems you have and challenges you have and how you can address them. If people don't know that we're renowned for being on time with hot food, you might say, well, that's what we need to let people know, because that's going to be a driver of consideration and preference. So it's a really useful addition to the platform this year.
Yeah, interestingly, for those consumers that know Deliveroo very well and they have really strong brand knowledge, they're 3.5 times more likely to consider using Deliveroo versus their competitor set. And so there's something there in terms of like, how do you kind of drive that knowledge and understanding within your audience? And that's when we start to see a lot of conversion through the funnel.
Yeah, I think just to quickly build as well, I think what's really interesting with a category like this is that there's also this component, particularly for brands such as Deliveroo, Uber Eats, Just Eat, where there's this almost B2B to C dynamic, and that their audience obviously are across both the restaurants themselves and obviously then the consumers. And from our side of things, of course, the data we're focusing in on is the consumer perception of the brand, and obviously their brand health accordingly. But from a business like Deliveroo, where the consideration obviously has to be across both the consumer, so what does that consumer or customer experience and that journey look like, versus then like, what does it look like in terms of how they then are showing up for those restaurants that they're effectively representing. And Conor, you called out that, to you, an indicator for reliability will be, is my food going to arrive hot and warm? And I believe a few years ago, one of the fast food chains pivoted away from partnering with food delivery businesses and instead just launched their own direct delivery service, because they were receiving feedback from customers that some of the food was arriving cold or sort of lukewarm. And so it's a really interesting dynamic, I think, for a brand like that, where it's obviously not just about holding themselves accountable for consumers and building brand in that respect, but it's also about how they're then showing up from a retail perspective as well.
Before we finish up, were there any other kind of big marketing moments this year that kind of you think back and kind of go, God, that was a clanger, or that was a brilliant one, or I love that? I didn't ask you to prep for this, so I'm curious. Anything top of? I'll take out the long pauses.
I mean, one of the things I think we touched on in episode 1 actually was on Guinness Zero. And I think for me, from a marketing perspective, we spoke throughout this episode of the power of like consistency, brand equity, how the brand shows up. And I just think obviously over the past year to see then how they've just continued on as you would expect in terms of their execution, how they've showed up, is just, for me, I think it's outstanding. I think it's sort of a best-in-class example of how a brand can really adopt that platform, that identity, and then ensure that they then execute continuously on. And they are a category leader in both categories for alcohol and non-alcohol.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think back to a few others. I would love to, as part of the retro, maybe because the results didn't go the way we predicted, and maybe because I'm now back in Sydney, but the examining the bonds expansion
Yeah.
and did leading with, a very Australian launch into a new market and owning all the Australian isms associated with Robert Irwin, who's gone on to conquer US Dancing with the Stars. Used to be a phenomenal export. Has that actually translated into market share for bonds? And is that actually a playbook that they'll keep leaning into beyond just launch, but into like, how do they think about like growing market share? Is it lean into that Australian heritage, or is it, do you want to Americanize a bit more to build relatability, as we've seen as such a core brand perception with the US audience? And I'm also just more broadly fascinated by that market is so large. And even if we look at Elf and they're acquiring Rhode for $1 billion, but they're not even near middle of the pack in terms of brand health within that category. So how do you launch, build market share quickly, but then know you have such a enormous journey to go?
Well, guys, listen, thanks so much. It's been brilliant all year chatting to you. I've loved it. I think it's been really interesting, the conversations we've had. I hope people have found it useful. Definitely the feedback we got has been amazing. What's been great is we've been able to cover so many stories through the singles. And as we say in every episode, we have opinions that we're more than willing to share, but we base them all on the data that's coming out of the Tracksuit platform, which is, when you think about all the different categories, all the different markets we've talked about, all the different brands, types of brands, it's been amazing to show the depth of what Tracksuit is able to do for brands. So I hope you both enjoy a well-deserved rest coming up, although Dan, it may not be so restful for you with the new arrival juice. But listen, enjoy the break.
Thanks, Conor.
Thanks.
Merry Christmas.
Same to you. Cheers. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of That's What I Call Marketing, looking back to some of the biggest stories in 2025. And of course, if you did and can rate or review the show, share it with one other person, subscribe to That's What I Call Marketing. We have over 43,500 people subscribed to That's What I Call Marketing now. So join them and you'll never miss an episode again. Thanks, as always, to the team at Tracksuit. It's wonderful partnering with them on these episodes. As I say in every episode that we do of the singles, we're powered by the data of the Tracksuit platform, and then we have a great conversation about the brands that we feature in the episodes. And if you're a brand that's featured in the singles and would like to come on That's What I Call Marketing and chat to us about your side of the story, definitely get in touch. We would love to feature you on That's What I Call Marketing. Tracksuit is available in 25 markets, and if you would like to change your brand tracking next year, go to gotracksuit.com, register to get a call from the team, take a 20-minute call, let them show you the platform. Honestly, it's powerful, transformative platform for brands where brand tracking was out of reach for so long. Now it is within your reach. It is affordable. You can track multiple things, multiple brands, multiple markets, and it is all available to you at gotracksuit.com. And honestly, take my word for it, it is an amazing tool to have. So that is it for this episode of the Singles, and that is it for That's What I Call Marketing in 2025. It's been another wonderful year with amazing guests, amazing people listening and tuning in, amazing people leaving comments, amazing people leaving reviews and feedback. I thank every single one of you for engaging with That's What I Call Marketing, and I really appreciate it. We have amazing episodes already planned for 2026. Some of them ready to be edited over the Christmas holidays, and I can't wait to bring those to you as I say, some amazing guests. So enjoy the break that everyone has. If you have a break, enjoy it, and I will chat to you again in January. Take care.